I guess, yeah, to start off, Sarah, I was thinking about security and it's such a big topic. And if someone who is like in high school is asking about like, oh, how do I get into tech? How do I learn about security? I'm never really sure how to frame it to them. It's not really my thing. So I don't know. Can you help me out with that? Is there anything that you can think of how to explain that to someone in high school?
That is an excellent question. And I think, I mean, yeah, I have some ideas, but I think I know somebody that might be able to answer this better. So I'm going to ask another Sarah to come and help us out with this. Sara Van Tol, are you out there?
Yes, I am here to answer the call. Hey everyone, my name is Sarah and I'm an Azure Applications and Infrastructure Specialist here at Microsoft Canada. I'm currently working with a wide variety of customers across Canada in different industries, from healthcare to financial services. Essentially, in my role, I help educate our customers on what the cloud is and some of the incredible benefits that it can provide. I assist customers in their migration journey. I touch on some security and governance aspects, also on app modernization, share some best practices, and I essentially connect customers with the right resources to support them throughout their cloud journey. Yeah, cloud security, it's basically, it consists of a set of policies, controls, procedures, and like technologies that really work together to protect like cloud-based systems, data, and infrastructure. So all the way from like authenticating access to filtering traffic, cloud security can really be configured to the exact needs of like the business or the organization. So especially as organizations, they're beginning to kind of shift their data and applications to the cloud, security can sometimes become an afterthought, actually, since many assume that it's now the vendor's responsibilities to actually put in and implement proper security procedures. But it's so important to really understand that security is a shared responsibility. So I'd really want to emphasize that to them, since it's really shared between both the organization and the cloud vendor. So it is still super important to put in security policies into place and to have information to protect your data and wherever it's stored.
I love that. I think, yeah, the shared responsibility thing is huge. It's actually surprising to me how many customers think that, oh, you don't do like all of these things around security. It's like, no, because you have to decide that for yourself. Like you
Exactly.
have to, of course, we want to support you in doing that, but like you have to also take some initiative, and you're gonna have different policies than a different customer. And depending on your industry, you have different needs you need to meet. So yeah, I think that's a great way to frame it to someone, because yeah, security is a big topic, and that high level overview is a good place to kind of start thinking about it that way.
Yeah, it's not like a wash your hands and done kind of thing. It's like constantly going to be there and have like a conversation with that. So it's so important to have it on both sides for sure.
Mhm. And
Absolutely.
is that something that you find so far? I mean, that is well understood in terms of when you first have the conversation, or do you find that it's kind of you need to come at it a couple times and really, because as you're saying, it's so ingrained in potentially like business policies that it has to be more of like an ongoing.
Yeah, no, it definitely is something that you have to kind of do a lot of like education around for customers, since a lot of them don't have massive security teams either. So it's like they're almost kind of becoming like security experts as like the process goes. So lots of education, lots of workshops, talking with some of the experts that we have who are more like advanced in that section so that they can answer some of those more complicated topics. But it definitely is more of a journey as opposed to just like, oh yeah, I know what that is and how to do it. It's more of that conversation and the learning together almost.
And I think that's a great introduction. And I also think that was a great segue into kind of the next place you want to go with this. Is, maybe from a high level perspective, it's great to know it's a shared responsibility, and it's an ongoing conversation, and there's all different parts of moving parts that encompass what is security and when it comes to the cloud. But then the next thing, Sarah, that I was thinking about too is, okay, great, we understand that at a high level, and maybe someone's already working in the cloud today, but they don't really have a good grasp on what tools are available to them. So of course today we're approaching it from the Azure perspective, but when it gets a little bit more deeper, like what tools do we use? How do we do this? How do we actually start to implement security and make sure that our system, everything we're using in the cloud, is secure? Um, how do you even start thinking about that? It's very scary to start. It just
Mm-hmm.
seems overwhelming. So do you know, like, where can I start if I'm trying to talk to somebody about that?
Yeah, totally. Well, there's a lot of resources actually online as well that kind of support that education piece. I know Microsoft Learn actually has tremendous amounts of like documentation and courses that you can go through and actually start to like learn and play around with it. But yeah, like overall, like security is such like a huge topic. And at Microsoft, obviously, we've been doing a lot of investment into that space as well. I believe it's like 1 billion a year we're investing to improve like products and services, making sure we're hiring the right personnel for that security front. So always looking for ways to do that. But yeah, there's tons of workshops that some of our partners run that are just great experts. So when I'm having conversations with some of these customers and they're new and they're just dipping their toes into it, we love kind of presenting them with these kind of like opportunities or deep dives with some of our technical team and hands-on workshops where it actually gets them thinking and familiar with the tool, so it becomes less daunting for them as well, which is important.
I think that's great to mention like the hands-on part. And with that, I guess also I'd like to call it to Sara Scherr about, you are a cloud solution architect working with that. So when we talk about actually getting hands-on with the customers, like what does that look like for you?
Hello, everyone. My name is Sara Scherr. I'm an Azure Cloud Solutions Architect, focusing in security on the applications and infrastructure side of the house. My background has been traditionally in security, networks, and virtualization. And since transitioning to Microsoft, I decided to customize this because the world of security is always evolving. And there's a lot of unique aspects when you're taking on security as opposed to just looking at a checklist and I've got things locked up. It depends on where they're at. It depends on the customer and their industry, because things that come to play with, healthcare or finance have very stringent, although very generalized guidelines. It's hard to go to a customer and say, well, this is the documentation for ISO. And they say, can you remediate this backup policy in a certain way? And a business will say, oh, what is our business policy? Like, they're not sure. They know they take up backup jobs, but can they restore from them? Like, there's a lot of questions you have to ask about the business before you start putting them into like what I would consider a secure locker room, right? Like, we need to know where the equipment goes. The hockey sticks go over here, the basketballs go over there. Where are the backups? Where are your documents saved? Who has access to those? And that's so fundamental to getting the right step in deciding a solution, because you can't just pick one product and voila, you have security. Like, that's not it. You have to help them understand their business first and also understand their skill set, because cybersecurity is a brand new field. Like, I feel blessed that I've had opportunities to work with it along the way, but brand new people that are coming in with their degrees or certifications, without that experience and some of that insight, it can be very daunting when, security is the hot new field and everybody has a security product that will, supposedly solve everything for them.
Well, that's a really interesting point on like in the past, like so far, Heather and I have had a lot of discussions about specific kind of areas or products that address certain things. But the thing with security is it's kind of everywhere, and everything has to be built with security in mind, but then also like managed after the fact. So how do you see that playing out, either in workloads or just organizations across the board where, it's not necessarily just one product that solves a particular thing, and it's more that you kind of need to think about it as almost like a methodology or like a framework across the board. What do you, like, as you mentioned with cybersecurity being on the newer end of that, where are you seeing some of the biggest challenges there of like what it takes to actually deal with that?
I think the approach is, I have a mandate or a compliance regulation that I want to score against, because customers are driving security more than businesses are, right? Certainly licensing and costs and expertise come into there, but customers are demanding that you have certain certifications or that you can demonstrate in their RFPs or RFIs what your security posture is. And so the key component to being successful there is layering on it. So I need to have a monitoring solution, so I know that things are operational, but I also need a security solution that's going to look at things as I add on to this piece. Am I using secure VPN tunnels? When I'm coding, do I have some type of secure DevOps SDK and put it into my code so I know that people aren't changing it as it gets checked in or as it goes through a pipeline? That is still a brand new thing. There's a number of scanners out there, but there's not one code scanner that kind of solves it all. And so a lot of the advice that people ask for is, how do I secure all of this? Well, we've got to check each one of these equipment boxes. We've got to check your hockey sticks and your basketballs and your soccer cleats, and make sure that there's something for each of those pieces and build them in where you can centralize it, right? Because you don't have time to go check in each one of those lockers to make sure, yep, nobody can get in here. You've got to have a way to look at all those lockers at the same time.
Mm-hmm. And just
great
on that,
analogy.
like, are we finding that it's, because of course, as we were just talking about, it kind of almost becomes a part of everyone's responsibility. And Sara Van Tol, you mentioned that a lot of customers don't have super big security teams just because, you know, everyone has a bunch of different jobs to do. But how do we see that happening with like where everyone to some extent needs to be a little bit closer to understanding the security, where maybe in the past it was just, you know, one team that deals with it or one role? Is that something that we're seeing a little more often, where everyone kind of has to understand the security aspect of everything a little bit more?
Oh yeah, totally. I think like even going in with that like zero trust mindset, where it's like never trust, always verify, especially for the employees as well. Like there's so many different like phishing attempts and things that kind of come through. And if employees aren't even educated on like how to keep their passwords safe, or like how to go about that, like the business is at risk, right? So it's kind of finding those avenues and doing that education and almost like testing the employees as well with some like, hey, like this was a practice and this is where we could look to improve, and like kind of shedding that light there. So I think it's so important that even though you're not necessarily like an IT expert or super advanced in like security, having those like core understandings of like, hey, this is what I can do to make myself more secure, my device, my passwords, like what I can do to have those best practices is so important. So I think we're seeing a lot more of that push from IT to kind of focus on that education and almost like upskilling for our employees as well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's actually, it's interesting to hear that perspective as well, where, and hearing as well, I think a lot of people think about security and they think about like super, I don't know, like coding and hacking into stuff. Like that's what first comes to my mind. I think of like the show Mr. Robot or whatever, but that's not really what it is. I mean, maybe part of it, but it's really about like the process and just education and awareness, and then the tools come in later. And it's interesting because I had the perspective of like at Microsoft how they train us on security, and there's all sorts of videos. But even onboarding in my new role, my new job, like we also had that, and I'm glad to see we had it. But all sorts of things about, yeah, like don't write your password on a sticky note and put it on your laptop, because these things may seem like obvious, but it's still good to make sure you're telling your employees this and giving them guidance on what they should be doing, because that's a starting point. It's just like awareness, and then later on all the other stuff can come.
Oh, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Like kind of moving them away from just going like your birthday or last name 1, 2, 3 or something like that. Or like it's not just like making them a bit more advanced, and also like obviously kind of layering in that like multi-factor authentication as well is just like so important, and just making sure that there's different layers of protection going on for sure.
Yeah, that whole like defense in depth thing. That's what we well, not just Microsoft, but I feel like everyone kind of talks about that from some, where you talk about the physical layer and then down to the data and stuff, and it matters at every layer. But yeah,
totally.
And I guess, so looking at, I mean, so far we've kind of touched on like, yeah, what is just either standard or what should everybody be thinking about. But Sara, Scherr, I'm interested in your take on this, of when we think about kind of like what's next for security. I mean, obviously many things in cloud are never truly finished, so everything's kind of next. But in security specifically, I mean, we have a bunch of things that are either drilling further into specific scenarios or addressing certain products. But what do you see as kind of either trends or in that kind of what's next category for security, like people that are focused on, you know, just maintaining systems today and making sure that everything is kind of secured today? What do you think that should be top of mind going forward when it comes to like cybersecurity?
I think, you know, traditionally cybersecurity, everybody had a virus scanner, and then everybody had a password manager, and then everybody got multi-factor authentication. I think What security is going to become more of a maintenance role. And I don't mean that in a negative sense, but using things like machine learning to proactively look at host and entity behavior, looking at tools that will give you the option to say, hey, this is what things look like on Thursday. Why are they different on this Thursday? And getting people to be proactive. Like when I have Sentinel conversations, I oftentimes say, this, machine learning piece might be something you do on Monday. Find out what happened. Because the more that you know your behavior, it's kind of like looking around at your house when you come home. You know if somebody's left the gate open or why is the garbage can knocked over. Those are suspicious things. But if you aren't aware that you put, your garbage can back in the same spot, those are the things that open things happen. It's not about a signature. It's not about a given vulnerability. It's people using lateral movement, trying different logins, because once they've compromised something, now they have a key to your house. Now they can open the bathroom mirror cupboard and look at your prescriptions. And that's where the value and trends in security are, and why it's so important to look at who's coming in and out, and making sure that we aren't giving away more keys than we need in terms of permissions. And certainly that goes to the same thing with code. You're putting out a product for your customers. You don't want to be giving away keys or openings for people to come in and look at that, like we've seen with things with SolarWinds that have impacted us recently in the news. So knowing that and that proactive attempt is going to be where I think things will start pushing towards, because we can't wait anymore. We have to know ahead of time kind of what our weaknesses are.
Mm-hmm. And that's something that I think is really interesting, and this kind of the bridge too with Heather, your experience on the data side is like, I mean, I love to talk about ML as much as the next guy, but when we talk about ML in security, like what are we really saying there?
So machine learning in predictive is taking like a look at your logs, right? And so we use something at Microsoft called log analytics, which is based on a set of data that's typically referenced in what's custo query language, or something very similar to SQL. Well, using tools that can take that same data set and running those custo language queries with a machine learning virtual machine allows us to do existing testing and experiments and insights on that data to see, what would happen if we make this change, or what types of activities are taking place. Because if you're looking at logs all the time, it's hard to tell what's going forward, because that has happened in the past, and there's not something really active taking place in the environment until we start looking at what changes are there. If I add this new MSP and I've got an extra 50 logins a day, can I tell based on their behavior, what can we find?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's like, is it fair to say it's kind of like an anomaly detection, which really you could use for a bunch of other stuff? Yeah. No, I remember, again, we don't need to get too deep into product discussions, but I do remember like there are certain products from Microsoft Stack it's like, oh, they already have built-in, that's what they are. They're literally machine learning algorithms that are looking at your network and looking for these kind of anomalies, and then it'll trigger alerts or something for you to just recognize those. But I feel like, yeah, setting it up, anything, just having that ability to look for weird patterns, that makes a lot of sense. And on that, and also, again, I don't want to get too much into the product, but something that I have never understood, and I would love to hear your explanation of it, is I don't understand what Sentinel is. I kind of understand what Azure Security Center is, but I don't want to, not even, only a little bit, but I don't understand like how they work together, or if they're separate, or yeah, anyways. So what's Azure Sentinel and what's Azure Security Center? What is the difference between those?
Uwe, do you want to take that one? And then I'll give you my take.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. I can kick it off, and then I'll probably pass it on. But essentially, I mean, there's a few, like we talked about, kind of what's your standard versus what's kind of taking that next step. Security Center really comes into like, if you have infrastructure on Azure, how are you monitoring and protecting those services, right? So whether it's just your VMs, for example, whether it's something that you're doing manually, and every time you add a VM, like making sure that it's that it's brought into Security Center, like we'll call it Security Center Standard, which is now Azure Defender for servers, which you can have Defender for SQL or Defender for, whatever you want. But for the server side of things, it's basically those, in the same way that Advisor lets you know about your environment and tells you kind of, hey, what should you look at across your Azure environment? Security Center essentially does that for your infrastructure pieces of, hey, maybe enable endpoint protection on these VMs, or, there's something funny going on with this VM, maybe make sure that you're, digging into the logs there. Basically just giving you that like raising of alerts that are happening on your infrastructure. So there's maybe different ways that you can do it, but certainly if you're in Azure, like it's easy to just turn on Security Center and have all that being watched. Whereas Sentinel can actually take that information and go one step further to then get into what we were talking about with the ML of, okay, how do we take all those alerts and things that are happening of the like day to day, and how do we use that information to look forward to say, maybe there's something that isn't necessarily happening today, but based on the things that are happening today, as well as just the other things that as Microsoft we're aware of that happen in cybersecurity, how can we have a better picture of what could be coming to make sure that we're as protected and as we can be, essentially. So they work hand in hand, where Security Center would be, I mean, in my opinion, kind of a starting place. And then you can layer in Sentinel on top of that. Do you need to have Security Center? No. In order to have Sentinel, you can't have it on its own. But there is kind of that coexistence relationship that can happen too.
Awesome.
I'll pass it on if anyone else.
Yeah,
has
I was gonna say,
I
would say I would love to hear if Sara, Scherr, if you have anything, or Sara Van Tol, if you have anything to add to that. But what I'm hearing first is like Security Center is, it was mentioned earlier about monitoring is a key component. You need to know what's going on. Then you also need to know how to take action in auditing and using kind of predictive algorithms to determine what should you do, or what can you do about this, and look for these anomalies. So I can see that helps to clarify the difference between it. But yeah, if either Sara wants to add anything to that, please go ahead.
Yeah, so when I was tasked with explaining Sentinel, I don't know, years ago now, there wasn't a whole lot of marketing around it. And the way that I look at this is if you've ever played Legend of Zelda, we had the Triforce, right? And so I draw this out, like I actually have a drawing of it. But if you think of the Triforce, like you've got Office 365 here, you've got Azure here with Security Center. And then at the top of this Triforce, and I know we're on the internet, people are going to think the Illuminati, but it's Sentinel, right? That oversees all of this. And the way that it differs is that Azure Security Center, Azure Defender, in the space that it lives now, is really a closed scope way of monitoring. It's also where we find our compliance. So if I need to know if I'm going to go with NIST or CSS or use the brand new Azure best practices, that's where we find that information. That's how we use advanced protection on our infrastructures and certainly find our recommendations. Whereas from the infrastructure side, as a security team, I'm going to go into Sentinel and I'm going to look at not only Microsoft products, but I'm going to oversee all of it. I'm going to see DNS scope. I'm going to see Palo Alto. I'm going to see all of my third-party tools. And I can start using that correlation of log data to then remediate accordingly. Because people don't just come through Microsoft Word, or they don't come through Azure VMs. They come in through a Palo Alto firewall, through a VPN tunnel that lands them in Azure. And then they go and make changes on a server in a different piece of software. So we need all of that to correlate and come together in this Rubik's Cube. And we can apply tools like remediation. We can fix things. But in many cases, you may have to go back to that native tool. So your Sentinel is a single pane of glass overlooking your Triforce, but it's also the tool that you can use as its own monitoring agent across multiple products and multiple clouds, which is unique.
That's
right.
okay.
You don't need to actually
even
have anything like on Azure or anything that way in order, I mean, maybe AD, but otherwise you can just use Sentinel standalone with whatever services you have on prem. Yeah.
You don't have to have a Microsoft entity, but usually that's the gain point because of, and I don't want to dig into a Sentinel conversation, but you have benefits to it through your Microsoft licensing. So at minimum, you should take advantage of it, even if it's just your first venture into security. It's such a great learning tool.
I think that's great to point out that it isn't just Microsoft, because I feel like well, obviously the conversations we've had, we're very biased. That's the tools we're going to recommend. But I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me that you have this kind of holistic tool, because you're not just going to be attacked on Microsoft services. There's other stuff you need to monitor as well. That clarifies it a lot. I feel like the next level understanding is like, you got to just do it. Like, you got to get hands on, otherwise it doesn't fully click. But I feel like that really helps, at least me, to clarify the differences between Security Center and Sentinel. And also, now we're going to have to put a disclaimer that we're not the Illuminati, but I'm but no, that's
my best effort. I'm not a marketing person. I'm a computer nerd. Let's do my expertise correctly.